So, hello everybody. Today we're going to do another book review. Today I'm going to take a look at two books. The Witcher, Sword of Destiny, and The Witcher, The Last Wish. So these were both released by Gollancz in the UK, and as you can see they are now all labelled with this terrible now on Netflix sticker, which doesn't come off because it's been printed on the cover, which I really hate. And the first thing that I want to say is that I know nothing about The Witcher beyond what I'm reading in these books. So I haven't seen the Netflix series. I've heard lots of things about it, most of them bad. Interestingly enough, it seems to be so bad that even the main character, the actor, has decided to quit being the Witcher and has decided not to keep going, which of course means he's refusing a steady paycheck, so it must have been pretty bad. I do know that there are 3 video games and that there is an RPG which I have and I've looked at twice over the span of a couple of years, and I didn't like it both times because I'm just too old for that crap. It's way too complex. At this age in my life, I don't want to spend my time systeming, I want to spend my time role-playing, so The Witcher role-playing game, not for me. But even there, I didn't really take a look at the lore. So we will be talking about the world of The Witcher, as you can find it in these 2 short story collections, which predate the 5 novels, which are the main body of work, which was then followed by another novel in 2013. Sometimes these books are referred to as the Geralt saga or Geralt of Rivia saga because the main character is Geralt of Rivia, who is a witcher. The world building is done in a very interesting way in that nothing is actually told to you about the world. There is no setup like you would find it in The Lord of the Rings, where you basically have all of the story told, and in the beginning, the Dark Lord, blah, blah, blah. But you're thrown right in the middle of things, and you have to spend your own sweet time piecing together what the world is like. So as a summary, and there will be spoilers in this, as always when I do reviews, it's a high fantasy world. You've got humans, and you've got elves, and you've got gnomes, and you've got dwarves, and there may also be other races that are, well, maybe sentient, we would say. Races where you could have a conversation with if you spoke their language. And then there are also monsters. Rusalkas, for example, griffins, wyverns, dragons are there as well, although they are slightly different because they are intelligent. If you know how to converse with them, you can. So manticores and things that are simply there to kill humans. And as you go through these short stories, you learn a couple of things. Number 1, there are witchers. And witchers are humans, they're all men, that have undergone genetic engineering. But unlike what we do in our world, where we take the genome and alter it in the cell, let's say before the child is born, like with the, with changes to the genome before the child, let's say the clone sheep Dolly was born, changes were made to the egg and sperm, basically embryo thingy that came out before she was born. They take already living children, boys, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, and these boys have to undergo, well, I suppose experimental magic, because magic in this world is pretty much reminiscent of alchemy. They use drugs, they use I would say, substances in the broadest sense of the word that can make changes at a genetic level in a human being. Now, from what I remember from school, if I were to change my genes, other than cancer, nothing would change. So I could not actually alter the ability of my eyes at genetic level to see in the infrared spectrum. It doesn't work like this. We could try and find out in my genes, in, for example, the X and Y chromosomes, if I had a son before he is born, to change it so that he could develop eyes that can see at different ranges. But of course, once you're born, that's it. You cannot really do this at genetic level. However, in this book and in this world, you can, and they do it. And as you read through the short stories, you learn a couple of things. Number one, the oldest race is the race of elves, but it's not the oldest race because it's been there before everybody else came, but the elves came in ships to the continent where this is set and populated it, and possibly killed whoever or whatever was there before and dispossessed them. But it's not quite clear. Sometimes I think I read that the dwarves and gnomes are older, but that was just one reference, and I'm not sure if this was just something that comes up in one of the short stories and is never later mentioned again, or if this is part of the lore, because we're looking at short stories that are not really connected that much. There are different segments of the Witcher's early life where some things, or well, early, he's I think in his 30s or 40s at this stage, where certain things are introduced. How magic works, how wizards and witches work, or mages, what witches are, and so on and so forth. So anyway, they take boys that have no family, that are kind of like extra because the family can't feed them, and they pluck them from the dirt, put them into an old castle somewhere in the middle of nowhere, and put them through training, physical training, but also those gene-altering substances. And those that survive, and most of them don't, become witches. And witches are genetically altered, they are quicker, they are very well trained, they are fighters, and before they enter into a fight, they will take drugs, so-called elixirs, that will help them to perform certain feats, for example, see in the dark. And why do they exist? Well, they exist because humankind, who arrived much later than the elves, have decided to take the land for themselves, but unfortunately the land is inhabited by beings, by creatures, which we would call monsters. They are not necessarily sentient, but they are dangerous to humans, and in order for mankind to spread, these dangers have to be eliminated. So essentially it's us going to Africa and exterminating all the lions because they eat our sheep. And so the witches are called to go out and kill the bad things that are there. And that's what they do. However, at this time of Geralt, the golden age of the witches is already over because humankind has essentially won and has exterminated many species at this stage. And this is also something that people bemoan. There are some who say we should have saved them, we have destroyed entire species, they will never come back, they are gone now. And what for? Just so that humans can spread. And humans aren't only encroaching on the wilderness and wildlife, but they're also encroaching on the elves. And there is one story where the Witcher finds out that there is a tribe of elves that are on the brink of starvation. And they employ a little puck-like satyr kind of being. And this satyr kind of being is seen by the towns or the village people as destroying the crops or, like stealing stuff. And he is. But what he's trying to do is he's trying to bring seedlings and crops to the elves, for the elves to learn how to plant them and how to survive. When which is a very interesting take on elves, because in Tolkien, for example, elves are the omniscient and we know it all and we're just the great old race and everybody else should bow to us and we're almost divine. And we rule everything, but we're just too good to take advantage of nature. Here you have elves that are on the brink of starvation and are just trying to survive. And it turns out that this particular tribe is probably not going to make it. So a very different take on the elves as a race. Elves that try to survive and fail because they do not govern or live in harmony with nature enough to be able to eke out an existence, because they have been pushed back so far. So they're more like on a reservation. And the term reservation is actually mentioned in the translation, where, you know, all of the half-men are supposed to go, the gnomes, the dwarves, the dryads, and so on and so forth. So all of these races are antagonists to humans. There are those humans that say we should live with them. There are those that say we should not live with them, we should kill them. This also becomes part and parcel of the story. And it is, in my opinion, a world... First of all, the world is really dark. I mean, it is really dark. It is also, it becomes more and more political, because you can see that there are different kingdoms and different duchies, and you've got different rulers, and they all have their own agenda. They're talking about marriage between kingdoms in order to strengthen their thrones, or in order to weaken a rival, because they don't have a son, they don't have a daughter, they don't have anyone to pass their throne onto, or they might want to marry such and such a princess or prince to get this kingdom on their side. So at some point there's kind of like a race for a girl called Ciri, and people are trying to marry her off, although they don't even know where she is. So it is highly political, and sometimes I think this is the better Game of Thrones, because it is highly political and quite involved, but the number of people that you see, the number of players on the chessboard is a lot more limited. And because it's a lot more limited, and because you keep following them, some of them die horrible deaths, just like in Game of Thrones, but it's always something that affects you. You care about these people, even if you don't like them. Not liking someone and really hating somebody still means you're caring for this particular person in a book or a story. So these two books pretty much set up the world, but you can read the novels without reading these. However, you're introduced to a couple of things. You're introduced to Yennefer and her very difficult relationship with the Witcher. It's also set up that most witches or female mages are barren. They cannot have children, although the Witcher says that his mother was a mage, which doesn't really make sense to me, because apparently they can't have children. And it's said a couple of times that they can't, or with a lot of difficulty and a lot of things that they have to go through, and mostly it doesn't work. But then in the first novel, there's kind of like an interlude where it says that one of the archmages, she's a woman, says all female mages should be sterilized because we should not procreate. And I'm like, well, if you're supposed to be barren anyway, I don't get this. So it could be that maybe there was a change between writing the short stories and then writing the novels and changing the law, but I was under the impression that female mages simply cannot procreate. Witches definitely can't either, because they are what's called mutants. And this was the first time that for me the language jarred, because I wasn't sure if this was a translation issue, because in a world of fantasy and high fantasy, the term mutant simply doesn't work. You know, it's something you would be expecting in a post-apocalyptic world. You know, it doesn't work in a high fantasy world. But it turns out that apparently in German it's also used. So I assume that it's the same in Polish, and that this choice was deliberate. So when it comes to the way he describes the world is described in a language that belies the high fantasy of it. It also refers to topics like radiation destroying the direct sunlight, or the sunlight having changed in such a way that now the radiation coming from the sun destroys certain flowers and plants, which means that if you want to grow them, you have to grow them underground with glass ceilings above them so as to filter out UV light or certain frequencies of light. So there are quite a lot of modern ideas in here, things that you see in our world, that the environment is being destroyed because humans have been doing something. They've destroyed the species, which has turned some areas into off-kilter habitats where suddenly maybe the apex predator is missing and something else is getting out of hand. They're using magic and in such a way that they produce a lot of elixirs, a lot of drugs which they take. So magic is quite often more like alchemy in classical fantasy. So it's all about potions, it's all about ingesting stuff, making things from different poisonous ingredients, deliberately poisoning somebody so that they actually develop a certain skill or ability or die in the process of this. So lots of people die because they try to do something or are used for trying out something where maybe 1 in 3 manages to get through. So the world itself is very scientific in a way. They also mention illnesses like leukemia, which of course that's a disease that doesn't usually come up in high fantasy. That's also more a post-apocalyptic or urban fantasy, modern kind of idea in there, But you also have consumption, which is more of a classical fantasy trope. And the most important things that come out of these 2 storybooks are, we learn about the witch's origin. We learn about a girl named Ciri. Ciri is the granddaughter of the lioness of Cintra, Calanthe, who is tied to the witcher Gerald by some twist of fate. And at some point, a huge force, the Nilfgaardians or Nilfgaard forces, invade the land. They take and destroy Cintra. They destroy all of its forces. Cintra is one of the kingdoms. Calanthe commits suicide in the end. There are 2 large battles, and one is fought on Sodden Hill, and 14 archmages die in the defense of Sodden, and the Nilfgaard forces are stopped at the river Yaruga. That's the political situation. So there is this force coming from the outside trying to invade this land, which is not a uniform land. They speak the same language, but they have different rulers. There are kingdoms that are different, but they are kind of working together in the face of the common enemy. And even before that, they were intermarrying to ensure that everybody was kept in power. So there is also a lot to be said about its the whole economic situation. Nilfgaard starts to flood the lands with cheap imports. So the defenders are in a bad economic situation because suddenly all of these cheap goods are coming in and people are starting to buy Nilfgaardian wares instead of their home wares because they are a lot cheaper. So not only is there a military presence and a military threat, but also an economic threat. And then there's also the question of how loyal are the half-men? How loyal are the dwarves, the gnomes, the elves, the dryads? And there are those that say we should basically start hunting them down and killing them. And there are also groups of elves that are trying to fight back to fight the humans, not the Nilfgaardians, but the humans in the lands that we're talking about. And I don't even want to start talking about the names of those countries, because they're so different, they're so... and I still haven't seen a single map in any of these books, which would have helped me. But let's say there is the Alliance, then there's the foe, the Nilfgaards. And maybe the Nilfgaards are the good guys, who knows? But at the end of the day, the Alliance is trying to make a decision. Do they want to exterminate the elves, the dwarves, and the gnomes? Because they could, in theory, ally with the Nilfgaardians and try to fight against the humans of the Alliance that arguably have taken the lands from them and taken away a lot of their rights. But then again, there are areas where the dwarves, the elves, and the gnomes are doing fine. They are part and parcel of the economy. They're part and parcel of the state. They hold office. So it's a very interesting and very intricate power balance. And you always feel as you're reading this that it will only just take one step, one misstep on the part of one or the other group to blow up the powder keg. And there are places where the half-men decide to fight back against the Nilfgaardians on the side of the Alliance. But the Alliance then still says, yeah, but they're a danger. They could just be convinced to turn, and they're turncoats, and we just need to take them out. So if you want to get feel-good fantasy, this isn't it. There is some, well, I guess you could say that there is some romance in there, although it's not very romantic. But it's very intriguing in that Andrzej Sapkowski manages to have high fantasy and magic, as well as economic strife and political strife, and putting it together in such a way that you as the reader are given a rich tapestry that is still understandable and that you can still follow. And although you have so many different people, so many different protagonists, so many different races and their problems to follow and still feel for them. You may not like them. You may actually dislike them. You may think that their arguments in favor or against certain actions are spurious. You may completely disagree with them, but I would say you will never, ever not have an emotional connection to them. And even disliking or hating somebody is an emotional connection, you know. And so this is really where these books have left me so far. So I've read the first two short story collections, and I'm almost finished with the first novel, which is called Blood of the Elves. And I am really intrigued by it. And I really have to say, if I want to compare it to other books of fantasy, it's definitely not Tolkien at all, because it's a lot more modern and it's a lot more, I would say, topical. And I would see why some people compare it to Game of Thrones / Song of Ice and Fire, because you have a fantasy world and politics, although there's a lot more high fantasy in these books than there is in Game of Thrones. But I just don't think that Martin ever managed to keep up the tapestry that he was trying to weave. Because, I mean, of course, he also never finished his series, and I don't think he ever will. But Andrzej Sapkowski has managed to build a world that is believable and complex, but also complicated and sustains this. With regard to the writing style, even in the first novel, it's quite episodic. So the different chapters read like disconnected short stories that feed into an overarching storyline. So it's not, so you find a lot of jumps, both geographically and in time. You have people who go into the narrative and then leave it again and then come back, or you come back to them. So it reads a lot like a short story collection, although a lot tighter than the actual short stories. And I don't know if he will sustain this in the following novels, if this is just his style. But as it is, his style is something that people may have to get used to, because mostly novels don't just jump so drastically from chapter to chapter, because you don't usually do this. So this is The Witcher, Sword of Destiny, and The Last Wish. I can totally recommend these books. If you are like me and you want nice books, then there is a really lovely Witcher collection in English, and it comes in a really nice box with the 2 short story collections, the extra novel, and the 5 novels that form the main part of the body of work of The Witcher. The translation, in my opinion, reads really nicely. I would have preferred a better editor, because there are still areas where you have problems with concord and government, or words are missing, words are double, spelling errors. So, but I think sometimes I wonder, because I was watching somebody else's booktube the other day, and she was complaining about reading this book, and it was like, it looked great, it was a hardcover and looked great, but she said it was full of typos, and I'm like, maybe editing and using correct language has just gone out of fashion, which I personally don't like. But if you can look beyond this, I can really recommend the English version, and I'm told that the German translation is also really good. I cannot speak for any other language versions, but English and German are really good. So that's the first installment on The Witcher. I may be talking about The Witcher again once I've read more of the other books. But until then, have a lovely rest of the day, week, and stay safe. Bye!